Have you ever been in a crowded place, lost in the noise of the world around you, when suddenly, something or someone stops you in your tracks? What would you do if, in the midst of all that chaos, you came face to face with someone you once loved, someone you thought you'd lost forever? Park Bo-gum had just finished a long day of meetings and was heading to the train station to catch his ride home. It was a busy evening, as usual, with people rushing to and from their destinations, the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, and the hum of announcements echoing across the station. It was the kind of bustling scene he had seen 1,000 times, a normal part of his daily routine. He had no expectation of anything unusual happening that day, no reason to think that this would be any different from the countless days before. He walked through the station, his thoughts occupied with the work he still had to do, the meetings he would attend the next day. But as he passed by a small kiosk near the platform, something made him stop. A glimpse. A flash of recognition. It wasn't like he was actively searching for it, but somehow, his eyes locked onto a familiar face among the crowd. It couldn't be. Could it? He stood there, frozen for a moment, as his heart skipped a beat. The face he saw across the room was unmistakable. It was her, his first love. The girl he had once known so well, the one he thought he had lost forever, the one he had tried to forget but never truly had. She was standing there, just a few feet away, her face turned slightly to the side as she waited for her train. It had been years since they had last seen each other, years since they had parted ways without closure, without understanding. The time apart had been long, but in that moment, it felt as though no time had passed at all. He stood still, his breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if it was just his mind playing tricks on him, if he was imagining things. After all, what were the odds? The station was crowded, and the chance of running into her here, of all places, was practically impossible. Yet, there she was. In front of him. Looking just as she had all those years ago. His heart raced as he tried to process what was happening. Should he approach her? Should he call her name? But what if she didn't recognize him? What if she had moved on, had forgotten about him, just like he had moved on from her? What if, after all these years, the spark they once shared had simply vanished? He took a few steps forward, still uncertain, his feet moving almost of their own accord. It was as though his body was acting before his mind could catch up. The crowd around him seemed to blur, the noise fading into the background. All he could focus on was her face, her presence, the way the years had melted away in the span of a heartbeat. He stopped a few feet away from her, his hands trembling as he finally called out her name. Gina? She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Her expression was one of disbelief, as though she wasn't sure if she was dreaming or if this was really happening. Park Bo-gum's heart raced even faster as he watched the recognition spread across her face. Park Bo-gum, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, as if she couldn't believe her own words. It was really her. There was no mistaking it. For a moment, they just stood there, looking at each other, as if both of them were unsure how to react, unsure of what to do next. So many questions, so many emotions, all tangled up in that one brief moment of eye contact. I never thought I'd see you again, Park Bo-gum said, his voice a little unsteady as he took a step closer to her. Her lips trembled as she smiled, a mixture of relief and something else in her eyes. I didn't think I'd see you either. What are you doing here? Park Bo-gum didn't know how to answer. What could he say? That he had been going through the motions of life, trying to forget her but never really succeeding? That he had never stopped thinking about her, even when he had convinced himself he was fine? I was just heading home, he said finally, his voice calmer now, though his heart was still racing. But this is unexpected. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, it seemed as though the years of separation didn't matter. It was as if they had never been apart. And yet, he knew that nothing could ever truly be the same again. The time that had passed between them had changed them both in ways they couldn't ignore. I didn't know if I would ever see you again, she said quietly. After everything that happened. I thought you'd moved on, that we'd both moved on. I never really moved on, he admitted, his voice low. I thought about you all the time. I just didn't know what happened, what went wrong. She looked at him, her eyes full of emotions he couldn't fully decipher. Neither did I. We just let time take us in different directions. There was a silence between them, one that was heavy with the weight of the years they had spent apart. The train station around them continued to bustle with people rushing by, but for Park Bo-gum and her, it felt as though the world had paused. Time seemed to stand still, and the only thing that mattered was this moment, standing face to face with the person he had once loved so deeply. He wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the gap between them, to explain all the things left unsaid. But the words felt so inadequate. What could he say after all this time? How could he even begin to explain the emotions that were surging through him? "I didn't think I'd ever see you like this again," he said finally, his voice a little more composed now, though his heart still felt like it was racing. "I never thought we'd meet in a place like this, of all places." She nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I didn't either. But here we are." She glanced around the station, her gaze distant for a moment before it returned to him. "I don't even know what to say. I thought about you so many times over the years, but I didn't know if you ever thought about me." Park Bo-gum met her gaze with a look of sincerity, his voice filled with a quiet honesty. "I thought about you every day. I never forgot about you. I guess I just never knew how to reach out, or if it was even possible to. We didn't end things the way I wanted. But here, now, I'm glad I see you again." She smiled faintly at his words, her heart softening with the realization that, despite everything, he still cared. "I've thought about you too," she said, her voice trembling just a little. "But I was afraid. Afraid that the past was too broken to fix. That we were too different now." He reached out slowly, almost hesitantly, as if he was unsure whether she would pull away. But instead, she didn't move, and when he gently took her hand in his, the connection felt immediate and natural, as though the years had not changed how they felt for each other. "I don't think we're too different," he said quietly, squeezing her hand gently. "We've changed, yes, but I think that's what makes this moment so important. We're not the same people we were before, but we still have something between us, something real. And I don't want to let go of that." She looked down at their hands, her heart heavy with the weight of everything they had lost and gained. "I don't know if we can fix everything," she said softly. "But I want to try. I don't want to live with what-ifs anymore." Park Bo-gum nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "I don't either. I don't want to live with regrets. We don't have to have all the answers now. We just need to be honest with each other and take it one step at a time." She smiled up at him, her eyes filled with something soft and vulnerable. "One step at a time sounds good." They stood there for a moment, both unsure of what to do next but feeling the pull of something undeniable. The train station continued its steady hum of activity around them, but for Park Bo-gum and her, everything else seemed to fade away. There was no rush, no deadline to meet. They had found each other again, and that was all that mattered in that moment. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter now, tinged with both hope and uncertainty. He looked at her, his expression calm but sincere. "Now, we take the next step. Whatever that is. We don't have to have everything figured out right away. But I think we're both ready for this, ready to see what happens." She nodded slowly, her hand still holding his, her heart beginning to feel lighter, more hopeful. "I'm ready to try," she said, her voice steady. "I don't want to keep running from what we could have. I want to see what we can build." Park Bo-gum's heart swelled with a quiet joy. It wasn't about rushing into something or pretending that everything was perfect. It was about taking the time to build something real, something meaningful. They weren't who they used to be, and maybe that was a good thing. They had both learned and grown, and now they had the chance to rediscover each other, this time as different people. "Then let's do it," he said softly, squeezing her hand once more. "Let's take that step." She smiled, her eyes bright with new hope. "Together." And with that, they walked towards the platform, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but it didn't matter anymore. They had each other, and that was enough. As they boarded the train, the world outside seemed to blur, the city fading away as the train began to move. The rhythmic sound of the tracks beneath them was soothing, almost meditative, as Park Bo-gum and she sat side by side in silence. The connection between them was undeniable, and for the first time in years, it felt as though everything was aligning just as it was meant to. They sat there, lost in their own thoughts, each of them reflecting on the moment that had brought them back together. The past felt distant now, no longer a heavy weight that defined them. They had learned from it, but they were no longer prisoners of it. What mattered was that they had found each other again and were willing to see where this new journey would take them. "What do you think will happen when we get to the next stop?" she asked, breaking the silence, her voice light but full of curiosity. Park Bo-gum glanced at her, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I don't know," he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "But I do know that I'm not afraid anymore. I used to worry about what the future would hold, but now, I realize it's not about the destination. It's about the journey we take together." Her eyes softened at his words. She had always feared the unknown, the uncertainty of what was ahead. But now, sitting beside him, she felt a sense of calm. The fear that had once clouded her mind seemed to dissipate in the face of something far more important, hope. She wasn't walking this road alone anymore. She had him by her side, and that made all the difference. "I've spent so many years running from what I didn't understand," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "I pushed away the things I cared about because I was afraid. But now, I see that I don't have to be afraid anymore. I don't have to be scared of what comes next, because I know we can face it together." Park Bo-gum reached over and gently took her hand in his, the simple gesture carrying so much weight. "We'll face it together," he said softly, his voice full of reassurance. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." The train continued to move forward, the rhythmic sound of the tracks beneath them steady and comforting. It was as though they were moving forward in sync with the train, each of them taking the next step into an uncertain future, but doing it together. The past was behind them now, and the future, whatever it held, was something they would navigate side by side. The evening sky outside the train window was gradually turning darker, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance as the train traveled through the outskirts of the city. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, and for the first time in a long time, Park Bo-gum felt a sense of contentment settle in his chest. He didn't need to have all the answers. All he needed was this moment, this person, and the hope that together, they could create something beautiful. "I don't know where we're headed," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But I know that it's where I want to be. With you." Park Bo-gum smiled, his heart full of warmth. "I feel the same way. Whatever comes, we'll take it one step at a time." For a while, they sat in silence, their hands still intertwined, the sound of the train the only thing filling the space between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, one of shared understanding and unspoken promises. As the train neared the next stop, they both looked out the window, watching as the city lights grew brighter, the world outside more alive. But inside the train, inside this small space between them, everything felt calm, like they were in their own little world. "Are you ready for the next step?" she asked, her voice soft, almost uncertain. Park Bo-gum turned to her, a reassuring smile on his face. "I'm ready. And I'll be with you every step of the way." With those words, she knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The train had taken them far already, but it was the journey, not the destination, that mattered. They had found each other again, and that was all they needed. As the train slowed, approaching the next station, Park Bo-gum squeezed her hand gently, a simple but meaningful gesture. Together, they were ready for whatever came next. The train slowed as it approached the next station, and for a moment, Park Bo-gum and she both fell silent. There was something about the quiet anticipation of the moment that felt significant, like they were on the brink of something important, something new. It wasn't just about reaching the next station, it was about what the next step meant for them, the two of them, together. When the train finally came to a halt, they stood up, ready to leave the car, but not quite ready to leave the moment. The door slid open, and the noise of the station filled the air, pulling them both back into the world outside. For a brief moment, they stood there, looking at each other, unsure of what to do next, yet knowing that this was just another beginning. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice quieter than before, almost as if she needed reassurance, even though she already knew the answer. Park Bo-gum smiled, his heart light. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he replied. "This is the right step. And whatever comes next, we'll face it together." She smiled back at him, her eyes filled with warmth and trust. It was funny how the uncertainty of the future seemed to vanish when she looked at him. There was a strength in their connection that couldn't be shaken by time or distance. All that mattered now was that they had chosen to move forward together, and that was enough. As they stepped off the train and onto the platform, the city around them was buzzing with life. People rushed by, oblivious to the quiet, significant moment taking place between the two of them. But to Park Bo-gum and her, this moment was everything. It wasn't about the crowd, the noise, or the busy world around them. It was about what they had found together, what they were willing to fight for. "Where to now?" she asked as they walked down the platform, her voice playful but sincere. Park Bo-gum looked at her, his heart full of hope. "Wherever we go, as long as we're together," he said softly, his eyes filled with quiet certainty. "That's all that matters." They walked together through the station, hand in hand, not needing to know where the next step would take them. What mattered was that they were taking it together. The future was still unknown, but in this moment, with her by his side, he felt ready for anything. As they exited the station, the night air felt cool against their skin. The city lights were bright, and the streets were busy with people heading home or out for the night. But for Park Bo-gum and her, it felt like they were in their own world, where time moved a little slower, and the only thing that mattered was the connection between them. "Do you think we can really make this work?" she asked after a moment, her voice soft, as if the question was something she had been holding inside for a while. Park Bo-gum looked at her, his expression steady and filled with conviction. "I know we can. We've already made it this far. And we'll keep making it work, step by step." She smiled at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and belief. "I believe in us," she said quietly. He nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "I do too. And whatever happens, we'll face it together. No matter what." They stood there for a moment, taking in the city around them, letting the world continue to move, knowing that they were ready for whatever came next. They didn't need to have all the answers, didn't need to have everything figured out. What mattered was that they had found each other again, and they were willing to try together. They started walking down the street, their steps in sync, their hearts in tune with each other's. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it felt a little less daunting now. Because, with her by his side, Park Bo-gum knew they could handle anything. "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly, her voice full of hope. "But I know I want to face it with you." Park Bo-gum smiled, his heart full. "So do I, together." And with that, they walked into the night, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the journey was just beginning. The days seemed to pass in a blur, each one leading them further into the unknown, but also drawing them closer. Park Bo-gum and she continued to navigate this new chapter of their lives with a sense of cautious optimism. The quiet moments they shared became their anchor, grounding them in a reality they were both eager to embrace. There were still uncertainties, but now, they were a team, facing whatever came next together. One evening, they found themselves at a quiet cafe, sitting in a corner booth, their conversation flowing easily. There was no pressure, no rush to define anything. They were simply enjoying each other's company, reconnecting in a way that felt natural, as if the years of separation had only deepened their understanding of one another. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, her voice soft as she stirred her coffee. "About us. About everything we've been through. And I can't help but wonder if this was always meant to happen. If we were always meant to find each other again." Park Bo-gum looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I've thought about that too," he admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "There were so many times when I thought I had lost you. That we were done. But now, standing here with you, I wonder if maybe it wasn't the end. Maybe it was just a pause, a way for us to grow and come back stronger." She smiled at his words, a gentle smile that reached her eyes. "I used to think that our story was over. That it was just a chapter one would have to close and move on from. But now, I see that the story isn't over. It's still unfolding. Park Bo-gum's heart swelled with emotion. He had always wondered about the future, about whether they would ever get another chance, but now, with her sitting across from him, it felt like everything had fallen into place. "I'm glad we're here," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm glad we're giving this another shot. I don't know where it will go, but I know that I'm willing to try if you are." She nodded, her gaze soft and full of trust. "I'm willing to try. I want to see where this can take us. But more than anything, I want to be with you." They sat there in comfortable silence for a few moments, both of them reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. They had been through so much, yet the love they had once shared still lingered, not as a memory of the past, but as something real and tangible that they were now ready to rebuild. "I never thought I'd find my way back to you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But now that I'm here, I feel like everything is falling into place. Like we were always meant to come back together." Park Bo-gum's eyes softened as he reached across the table, gently taking her hand in his. "I feel the same way," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "We were meant to be here, together. And we'll figure it out. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The weight of their words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning but also filled with hope. There was no guarantee that everything would be perfect, that the road ahead would be smooth, but they both knew one thing for sure: they had each other, and that was enough to face whatever lay ahead. As they finished their drinks and prepared to leave, the world outside the cafe seemed to fade away. The noise, the bustle of the city, didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the quiet certainty that they were walking this road together, one step at a time. As they stepped out into the evening air, Park Bo-gum took her hand in his grip firm but gentle. "Where do you want to go next?" he asked, his voice light but filled with meaning. She smiled, looking up at him with warmth and affection. "Wherever we go, as long as it's with you." And with that, they started walking down the street, side by side, ready for whatever came next. The future was still uncertain, but they were no longer afraid. Together, they could face anything. As the days continued to pass, Park Bo-gum and she began to embrace the unpredictability of life with a newfound sense of peace. They spent their time together, discovering the beauty of small moments, the laughter shared over coffee, the quiet walks through the city, the conversations that seemed to flow effortlessly. They both realized that it wasn't about grand gestures or perfectly planned days. It was about being present in the now, cherishing the connection they had, and appreciating the journey they were building together. One evening, after a particularly long day, they found themselves at a park near the river, sitting on a bench under the soft glow of a street lamp. The city around them hummed with life, but here, it felt like time had slowed. They sat in peaceful silence for a while, just watching the lights reflecting on the water, the sound of the river gently lapping at the shore. "I never thought we would get here," she said quietly, breaking the silence, her voice soft but filled with meaning. "After everything. I didn't think we'd have a second chance. But now, I realize that sometimes, things don't turn out the way you expect them to. And that's okay." Park Bo-gum turned to her, his gaze steady and filled with sincerity. "I never thought we would either," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But now that we're here, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the chance to start over, to make things right." She smiled at him, a gentle, heartfelt smile. "I'm glad we're here too. I'm glad we gave this another chance." They sat there for a while, both of them lost in the quiet beauty of the moment. There was no rush to say anything else, no need to fill the silence with words. The connection between them was enough. "I've been thinking," Park Bo-gum said after a while, his voice thoughtful, "about how much we've both changed over the years. How we've both grown, learned, and healed in our own ways. And I realized that we're not the same people we were when we first met. But that's okay. We don't need to be the same." She nodded, her eyes soft as she looked at him. "I've thought about that too. I used to think that we had to be the same as we were, that we had to go back to what we had. But now, I see that it's about creating something new. Something better. And I think that's what we're doing." Park Bo-gum smiled, his heart full of gratitude. "Exactly. We're not trying to recreate the past. We're building something new together, and that's what makes it so special." They sat in silence again, the weight of their words hanging in the air. It was a peaceful silence, one filled with understanding and acceptance. They both knew that there were still challenges ahead, that life would throw obstacles in their way, but they also knew that they had each other, and that made all the difference. As the evening grew darker, they stood up, ready to continue their walk. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and the air was cool and refreshing. They didn't know where they were headed, but they knew that as long as they were together, it didn't matter. Park Bo-gum turned to her, his expression soft and full of warmth. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice steady. "But I do know that I want to face it with you. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." She smiled, her heart full. "Me too," she said quietly. "I'm not afraid of what's ahead. Not as long as I'm with you." With those words, they began walking down the path together, their steps in sync, their hearts in tune with each other's. The future was still uncertain, but it didn't matter. They were ready to face it, hand in hand, taking one step at a time. As they walked through the park, the city lights flickering in the distance, Park Bo-gum felt a quiet joy settle in his chest. The uncertainty of the future no longer seemed like something to fear. It felt like something to embrace, something to explore. And whatever came next, he knew they would face it together, with love and understanding as their foundation.